The sun was a merciless hammer in the vast, empty sky, beating down on the cracked earth of the Arizona Territory. It was a land that baked secrets into the clay and bleached bones to the color of surrender. Out here, a man's life was worth the water in his canteen and the speed of his draw. For the woman lying half-conscious against a blistered rock, her life was worth nothing at all. They had left her for the buzzards. Her leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone a jagged white shard piercing through skin and cloth. She was Apache, her dark hair matted with dust and sweat, her face a mask of stoic pain. They had taken her horse, her water, and her dignity, but they had missed the small, beaded leather pouch clutched tightly in her hand, hidden beneath the folds of her torn tunic. She was Nita, and her resilience was a fire the desert had not yet extinguished. Miles away, a lone rider crested a ridge, his silhouette a stark cutout against the blinding glare. His name was Cain, and silence was his oldest companion. He rode a dust-colored Mustang that moved with the same weary purpose as its master. Cain wasn't looking for trouble, he was running from the ghosts of it. His past was a locked room in his mind, the key long lost. He saw the flicker of color against the rock, the deep turquoise of the woman's tunic. He wasn't a man given to intervention. The desert had its own cruel justice. And yet, he nudged his horse forward, an unfamiliar curiosity pulling at the threads of his solitude. Cain dismounted with a quiet economy of motion, his boots making no sound on the hard-packed ground. He approached Nita slowly, his hands kept carefully away from the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and fierce, filled with the defiant terror of a cornered animal. She tried to push herself up, a sharp cry of agony escaping her lips as she put weight on her shattered leg. Cain stopped, holding up a placating hand. He had no words to offer, the well of his voice had run dry years ago, clogged with the ash of a burning homestead and the memory of screams that were not his own. He uncorked his canteen, the sound of sloshing water loud in the oppressive silence. He knelt, offering it to her. For a long moment, she just stared, her gaze flicking from the water to his face, a face weathered by sun and sorrow, etched with lines that spoke of a pain deeper than her own physical torment. He saw the calculation in her eyes. Was this a trick? A prelude to a worse fate? His expression remained unchanged, a patient blank slate. Finally, her thirst won the battle against her fear. Her hand, trembling, reached out and took the canteen. She drank greedily, the cool water a blessing on her parched throat. He watched her, his mind a quiet observer. She's a fighter, he thought. They left a fighter to die. When she was done, she held the canteen out, but her hand fell limp, the last of her strength gone. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed into unconsciousness. Cain knelt beside her, his movements gentle as he examined the horrific injury. It was a clean break, but it was bad. Setting it here was impossible. He looked back the way he had come, then towards the distant, hazy mountains where his small, isolated cabin was nestled. It was a fool's errand. Bringing her there meant bringing her trouble with her. It was a trouble he had spent 5 years avoiding. But leaving her was not a choice he could live with. He carefully, methodically, began preparing to move her, his silence a promise of grim determination. The journey to his cabin was a slow, arduous ordeal. Cain had fashioned a crude travois from his bedroll and 2 long branches, cushioning Nita as best he could. Every jolt and bump of the terrain sent tremors of pain through her unconscious form, and each pained murmur she made was a stone added to the weight on Cain's soul. He walked beside his horse, leading it with a steady hand, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He knew that people weren't left to die in the desert by accident. Someone had done this to her, and they might come back to ensure their work was finished. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in violent hues of orange and purple, the long shadows of the saguaros stretching like grasping fingers across the land. It was in this fading light that he saw them, 2 riders, far in the distance, moving in a sweeping search pattern. They were too far to see him clearly, but their presence was a cold knot in his stomach. They were the ones. He pulled his horse behind a thicket of mesquite, his body held perfectly still, becoming just another part of the dusk. He waited, his heart a slow, steady drum, until the riders passed over a far ridge and disappeared. The threat was real. It had a face now, even if it was a distant one. He pushed on, the urgency lending a new strength to his tired limbs. By the time the moon had risen, a silver sliver in the inky blackness, they had reached the relative safety of his hidden valley. His cabin was little more than a one-room shack built of rough-hewn timber, but to Kane, it was a fortress. He carried Nita inside, her body light as a bird's in his arms, and laid her on his simple cot. The air in the cabin was cool and smelled of pine and old wood smoke. He lit a single lantern, the soft glow pushing back the shadows, and turned his attention to her leg and the grim work that lay ahead. Nita awoke to the smell of antiseptic herbs and the sensation of a tightly bound splint on her leg. The pain was a dull, throbbing fire, but it was manageable. A man sat in a chair across the small room, cleaning a rifle with meticulous, silent care. It was the rider from the desert. He didn't look at her, but she knew he was aware of her every movement. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her, but it was tempered by a confusing sense of security. The cabin was clean, defensible. A pot of broth simmered over the low fire in the hearth. He had saved her. But why? She shifted, and his head came up, his grey eyes meeting hers. There was no menace in them, only a profound weariness. She instinctively clutched at her side, her fingers finding the reassuring shape of the beaded pouch still tied to her belt. His gaze flickered down to it, then back to her face, a silent question in his eyes. Nita didn't answer. Trust was a currency she no longer possessed. She had trusted the men who had come to her small ranch, the men with polite smiles and legal-looking papers. The men who had offered to buy her land, the land her grandfather had secured from the government with his service as a scout. When she refused, their smiles vanished. They had dragged her out, broken her leg, and left her for dead. Now, this silent stranger was her reluctant guardian. He rose and ladled some of the broth into a wooden bowl, placing it on a stool beside her cot. He moved back to his chair, resuming his task with the rifle, granting her the illusion of privacy. As she sipped the warm, savory liquid, she finally decided to risk a single, broken word. "Why?" she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. Kane didn't stop his work. He didn't look up. For a long moment, she thought he hadn't heard her. Then, without a sound, he simply tapped his own chest twice with his fingers, a gesture she couldn't possibly understand, yet it felt like an answer. The following days settled into a strange, silent routine. Kane tended to her needs with a quiet efficiency, changing her dressing, providing food, and ensuring the fire never went out. He would spend hours outside, reinforcing the corral or simply watching the entrance to the valley, his rifle never far from his side. Nita's strength slowly returned, and with it, her spirit. She watched him, studying the rigid set of his shoulders, the deep sadness in his eyes. She understood silence. Her people often said more with stillness than settlers did with 1,000 words. But his was different. It wasn't a choice, it was a cage. One afternoon, as he sat patching a saddle blanket, his hands moving with practiced skill, Nita finally decided to bridge the chasm between them. With great effort, she propped herself up and untied the beaded leather pouch from her belt. It was heavy with significance, the last tangible piece of her heritage. She held it out to him. Kane stopped his work, his gaze fixed on the pouch. He hesitated, his internal struggle visible on his face. This was the trouble he had tried to avoid. This was the secret that had gotten her nearly killed. To accept it was to accept the fight that came with it. His mind flashed back, an unwanted intrusion of memory. A small farm, smoke clawing at the sky. The smell of burning wood and something else, something sickeningly final. A woman and a small boy, their faces, he squeezed his eyes shut, pushing the images down into the dark cellar of his mind. He had been silent ever since that day, the words burned out of him. He looked at Nita, at her imploring eyes, at the fierce pride etched on her face despite her brokenness. He saw in her the same fight his wife had possessed. To refuse this would be to let them die all over again. Slowly, he reached out and took the pouch. His fingers, rough and calloused, felt the worn leather. He opened it and tipped the contents into his palm. It wasn't gold or jewels. It was a single, folded document, yellowed with age, bearing an official seal. A property deed. The man who called himself Silas rode with an air of predatory confidence. He was dressed not like a trail-worn cowboy, but in a fine, dark coat, his boots polished to a high shine despite the dust. He was the enforcer for a powerful railroad baron, a man who saw land not as a home, but as a line on a map to be acquired by any means necessary. With him were 2 hired guns, brutish men named Jeb and Roscoe, whose loyalty was bought with coin and the promise of violence. Silas reined in his horse at the mouth of the valley, a smug smile playing on his lips. "He's in here," Silas said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Track the drag marks from the traver." The fool actually took her with him. Jeb spat a wad of tobacco onto the ground. "Want us to just go in, boss? Flush them out." Silas held up a gloved hand. "Patience, Jebediah. This isn't some back alley brawl. The woman has a deed that my employer desires. A legally binding one, unfortunately. Our initial approach was indelicate. This time, we will be more persuasive. First, we try reason. A man living in a hovel like this could always use money." He dismounted, straightening his coat. "You two stay here. Be ready. But let me talk to our silent Samaritan first. Every man has a price. We just have to find his." Silas walked toward the cabin alone, his stride unhurried. He saw Cain standing by the corral, watching his approach, a rifle held loosely in one hand. There was no fear in the man's posture, only a quiet, unyielding stillness. This, Silas thought, might be more interesting than he'd anticipated. He stopped a respectful distance away, offering a disarming smile. "Good day to you, sir," he called out. "My name is Silas. I believe you may have found something that belongs to me." Cain didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, a granite statue of defiance, the deed now tucked safely inside his own shirt. Silas kept his smile fixed in place, though it felt brittle against Cain's unblinking stare. "I'm a reasonable man," Silas continued, taking a slow step forward. "The Apache woman you're sheltering, she's a thief. She stole a very important document from my employer. We simply want it back. No harm need come to anyone." Cain's grip tightened on his rifle. His mind was a maelstrom, but his face was a calm sea. He knew this man was lying. The terror in Nita's eyes had not been the look of a thief, but of a victim. "I am prepared to be generous," Silas said, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a thick leather wallet, fat with bills. $200. A handsome sum for a man in your position. All you have to do is turn over the woman and the document she's carrying. You can ride away from here and forget any of this ever happened." Cain remained silent. He let his gaze drift past Silas, to the 2 figures waiting at the valley entrance. He then looked back at Silas, and for the first time, his expression shifted. It was a subtle change, a hardening of the jaw, a coldness in his eyes that spoke a clearer refusal than any word could. The silence unnerved Silas. It was a weapon he didn't know how to counter. "No? Perhaps you misunderstand your situation." Silas's voice lost its silken edge, replaced by a thread of steel. "I am not asking. That deed is worthless to her, but vital to the progress of this territory. You are standing in the way of industry. In the way of powerful men. Think carefully about the choice you are making." Cain thought of the smoldering ruins of his own life, destroyed by men who spoke of progress while they held torches. He thought of Nita, her broken body and unbroken spirit. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The negotiation was over. The smile vanished completely from Silas's face, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "So be it," he snarled, turning his back on Cain and stalking back towards his men. "You had your chance, you stubborn fool." He mounted his horse, his movements sharp and angry. "Roscoe, Jeb. The hard way it is. I want that deed, and I don't care what you have to do to get it. The woman is irrelevant now." So is he. As Silas and his men spurred their horses back toward the tree line to plan their assault, Cain moved with swift, silent purpose. He bolted the heavy wooden bar across the cabin door and checked the shutters on the 2 small windows. Inside, Nita watched him, her dark eyes wide with fear. She had dragged him into her fight, and now he was going to die for it. Cain caught her gaze and offered a small, reassuring nod. He handed her a loaded pistol, an old Navy Colt. Her hands were shaking, but she took it, her resolve hardening. She might be crippled, but she was not helpless. As dusk settled, casting long, menacing shadows across the valley, the attack began. A shot rang out, splintering the wood next to the window Cain was watching. He didn't flinch. He had spent the afternoon preparing, using his knowledge of the cabin and the surrounding terrain. He had dug a small trench behind the woodpile, offering a secondary point of cover. He knew which floorboards creaked and which shutter had the best firing angle. This was his land, his fortress. Jeb tried to rush the front door, using a heavy log as a battering ram. As he got close, his foot snagged on a tripwire Cain had set, sending him sprawling. Cain fired a single, careful shot from the window, not to kill, but to wound, to slow them down. The bullet tore through Jeb's shoulder, and he screamed, scrambling back to cover. The night erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, the flashes from their rifles like angry fireflies in the growing darkness. The siege wore on for what felt like an eternity. Gunsmoke filled the small cabin, sharp and acrid. A bullet pierced the wall near Nita, showering her with splinters, but she held her position, the pistol steady in her hands, watching the back window as Cain had instructed. Roscoe, the larger of the 2 henchmen, had managed to circle around to the rear of the cabin under the cover of darkness. With a powerful kick, he shattered the small back window, intending to climb through. Nita didn't hesitate. She fired the pistol, the roar deafening in the enclosed space. The shot went wide, but it was enough. Roscoe recoiled, surprised by the resistance from inside. It gave Cain the second he needed. He spun from the front, firing his rifle. The bullet found its mark, and Roscoe fell backward with a final, choked cry. 1 down. But Silas was smarter. He used the distraction to set a fire against the cabin's front wall. Flames began to lick at the dry timber, smoke pouring through the cracks. "Give me the deed, you fool!" Silas screamed from the darkness. "Or you'll burn in there together." Panic began to set in. They were trapped. The fire was growing, the heat becoming intense. Cain looked at Nita, a question in his eyes. "Surrender?" She shook her head fiercely, her face grim with determination. She pointed to a loose floorboard near the hearth, one he had never noticed. Her grandfather, she signaled with her hands, had built this cabin first. There was a way out. A small root cellar. Just as Cain pried the board loose, the front door burst open, kicked in by a furious Silas. He stood there, silhouetted against the raging fire, his pistol aimed directly at Cain. It was over. But then, another sound cut through the night. The thunder of hoofbeats, too many for just one man. A voice boomed, "Silas Blackwood! Drop your weapon! You are under arrest!" A tall, broad-shouldered man in a sheriff's vest stood behind Silas, flanked by 3 deputies, their guns all trained on the enforcer. Silas froze, his face a mixture of disbelief and rage. He slowly lowered his pistol, the fight draining out of him as Sheriff Miller stepped into the smoky cabin. The deputies quickly apprehended the wounded Jeb and secured the scene. Miller, a man known for his unwavering sense of justice, looked from the fire to the splintered walls, then to Cain and Nita. "Got your message just before sundown," Miller said, his eyes on Cain. "The boy you sent to town said it was urgent." Looks like he wasn't exaggerating. Cain gave a slight nod, a silent confirmation. Before the siege began, he had seen a prospector's son checking his traps down the creek and had silently handed the boy a coin and pointed him urgently toward the town, a desperate, long-shot gamble that had paid off. Sheriff Miller knelt beside Nita, his expression softening. "I've been hearing rumors about what Blackwood's employer has been up to. Trying to scare folks off their land for the new rail spur. When the boy mentioned an Apache woman was involved, I remembered your family's name. Your grandfather was a good man. This deed, he said, looking at the document which Cain now handed him, is as solid as the mountain it's written on. We'll see it's honored. Weeks later, the valley was quiet again. The cabin had been repaired, the scars of the fight slowly fading. Nita's leg was healing, and she could walk now with the aid of a carved crutch. The railroad baron's scheme had been exposed, his enforcers jailed. Her land was safe. She stood beside Cain, looking out at the valley, bathed in the gentle light of the morning sun. You saved my life, she said softly. You saved my home. You saved everything. Cain looked at her, then at the peaceful land, a landscape so different from the one in his nightmares. A profound change was happening within him, a thawing of a long, frozen river of grief. He opened his mouth, his throat tight, and a sound emerged, rusty and unused, but clear. Nita, he said. It was just her name, but it was the first word he had spoken in 5 years. It was the sound of a lock turning, a door creaking open. It was the sound of a new beginning. We hope you were inspired by this story of courage and redemption. Cain's journey reminds us that even after the deepest loss, our capacity for compassion can lead us back to the light. If you enjoyed this tale, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the heart. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an update.